Firas, thank you very much for the kind introduction, very kind words of introduction, and thank you to you and Professor Hilscher for the very kind invitation to speak in this series of talks, the Gotha Manuscript talks that I have been enjoying in the past years as well. It's a great honor and pleasure to present my research here. I hope the slides are moving. So we have a lot of material to cover, and I will start right away, and then I look forward to the discussion afterwards. So our journey begins in the 19th century with the Russian bishop and scholar Porfiry Uspensky, who in the 1840s undertook some trips to monasteries and monastic libraries across the Eastern Mediterranean, visiting Athos, Sinai, Marsaba, and Egypt. Then, as the head of the newly founded Russian Orthodox ecclesiastical mission in Jerusalem, he was able to extend his stay in the Levant and do more manuscript research. And as a result of these trips and manuscript expeditions, he took some of these manuscripts back to the Russian Empire, also some icons. And he's well known for his role in uncovering or discovering the Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest manuscripts of the Bible, the Uspensky Gospels, the earliest minuscule Greek manuscript of the Gospels, and many other things. One of his interests in looking at these collections on the Sinai and elsewhere was also to catalog the Greek manuscript collections. He's interesting for us because he visited Sinai twice. And the second visit to St. Catherine's Monastery on the Sinai in 1850 was a longer stay between June and August, where he also examined the Codex Sinaiticus once again and brought with him a team of collaborators who were responsible also for examining the manuscripts and other items in the collection of the monastery. And there are also some drawings by one of his collaborators that are still extant. Now, here on the image, you can see one of the manuscripts that he brought back to Russia with him. Now, although Uspensky was interested mostly in the Greek manuscripts, he had some collaborators that were also interested in the Arabic collection. And he tasked apparently two of his collaborators, Krylov and Saruf, who later became a teacher of Arabic in St. Petersburg, to prepare a hand list or a very preliminary list of the Arabic manuscripts in the Sinai collection. This list was published later in 1891, and you can see it here on the screen. It's interesting for us, this list, because there we see the mention of several books, manuscript books in Arabic of history. One of them, as the catalog says, was a book of history in old script with pages glued or stuck to one another. Well, that's quite an interesting description. So clearly they deciphered the contents to the extent that they realized it's a book of history, but they couldn't say more about it because the pages were stuck. Now, fortunately, within the Sinai collection of Arabic manuscripts, there aren't that many books of history, so we can sort of try to rule out which manuscripts they could have meant. Among the most famous manuscripts with historical texts on the Sinai, we have, the history of Agapius of Mabbug, the history of Eutychius of Alexandria. But these manuscripts, as well as others, manuscripts with historical texts, do not match this description of having the pages stuck to one another. Looking through the collection, I think it's quite clear now that I would suggest that what they saw back in 1850, is actually the same manuscript that we will be discussing today, Sinai Arabic 597, a book of history with pages glued to one another. And here is a table with what I think is a concordance with modern shelf marks and the manuscripts mentioned in Uspensky's catalog, although I'm not certain in all cases that this is the exact identification. In any case, it's quite clear that what we'll be discussing today is what they already saw in 1850. This is what the manuscript looks like today. So it lost its binding. It's not in a very good state. And as you can see here, some of the pages are really glued to one another still. Some of them were opened, leading to further damage to the pages. Some of the pages are easily legible and in a good state, but as you can see, I've put a list down there. Many of the pages of this manuscript are still not that easy to read. The first printed catalog description of this manuscript was published by Margaret Gibson in 1894. As you can see, a very brief description. Just the second part that's interesting for us is just described as a book of history of the world. The latest really information that we find in catalogs is Attia's hand list of 1955, where he just says that the second half of the manuscript is in a later Nast, containing a book of history of years and times, from the creation to the truce between the Fatimids and the Byzantines, which is a mistake. I can come back to that if you wish at the end. And he adds, this latter part is defective and could not be microfilmed. So the entire second part, containing the chronicle that we'll discuss today, really wasn't microfilmed in the 1950s nor later. And that's why until recently, there was really no research on this part possible. Fortunately, thanks to the Sinai Manuscripts Digital Library project in its first phase, which digitized more than 1,100 Syriac and Arabic manuscripts in the collection, this manuscript is also now available online and can be studied by scholars. There are a few studies on it, but they concerned so far only the first part, which is an older manuscript attached to our manuscript, which contains the Book of Daniel. This has been studied by other scholars, whereas the second part with the chronicle, to my knowledge, before I started working on it in January, February 24, there was really no research on it, or nothing published in any case. I presented this discovery twice already, once in Frankfurt and a second time in Tübingen this summer. And this is basically the third presentation on this discovery. I should also mention that independently of me, another independent scholar has come across and started to examine this manuscript this year in April and May. His name is Alexander Hurani, and he has provided a preliminary transcription of the text and announces a forthcoming study. I'm also working on a critical edition and on a longer study on it as well. So for today's talk, I really thought that it would be interesting to first present the text itself, the chronicle, what it is and how it relates to Syro-Chalcedonian history writing, and I'll explain also what the term means. And then the second part, hopefully we'll have enough time to discuss the manuscript itself and why it was forgotten until now, basically. And then we can draw some conclusions and then open the floor for discussion. Now, the chronicle itself is a Syro-Chalcedonian chronicle. What do I mean by this? And I'm sorry if this is a bit too basic for some of you, but just as a reminder, Syriac Christianity can be divided in several branches. The Church of the East, or East Syrian Church, is a church that broke off, let's say, from the early church after the Council of Ephesus in 431. The Syro-Orthodox Church broke after the Council of Chalcedon in 451. What we are discussing is the Syro-Chalcedonian branch of the Syriac-speaking church, which adhered or accepted the decisions of the Council of Chalcedon and remained in communion with the Byzantine and the Roman Church. Now, within the Syro-Chalcedonian church, there are also two branches, a Melkite, Diothelite, and Maronite, Monothelite tradition in the first millennium. These two terms mean that one group believed that Christ had two wills, human and the divine will. The Monothelite group believed that Christ only had one will. And why is this important for us? Well, if we look at the production of historiography in Syriac, mostly what scholars have discussed so far are West Syriac Miaphysite or Syro-Orthodox chroniclers, which are plenty, or East Syriac Nestorian chronicles. So these are the two main branches of the Syriac Church, and both of them produced plenty of historical texts, plenty of historiography that is really relevant for the history of the Near East and of the Syriac Church in general. The Syro-Chalcedonian branch, both in its Melkite and Maronite sub-branches, didn't really produce much historiography. The only things that we know, the only text that we know until now, is a short chronicle found in another Sinai Syriac manuscript, the Chronicle to 641, then a Maronite Chronicle to 664, and we know from later sources that Theophanes of Edessa, who was very likely a Maronite, also wrote a history, which is lost. Now, the text that I'll be presenting today thus adds a significant new and long chronicle text to this Syro-Chalcedonian tradition. Although it's only extant in Arabic, but as I will show later on, or mention later on, it's clearly a translation from the original Syriac. So what is this chronicle? It's only found in this manuscript from Sinai, 597. It's quite a long text. It covers 70 folios, even though there's not much text on one page. As I already mentioned, some of the folios are damaged or stuck together. According to the title, it's a book of history of years and times, called in Greek chronikon, and it starts from the creation of the world with the help of Christ, God above all. It covers the entire span of human history and ends quite abruptly with the events of the years 692, 693. And as I said already, so until early 2024, this text was basically unknown. So why do we call it the Chronicle of 713? Fortunately for us, within the text, there is an explicit reference to the year in which this author was writing. So he says, he basically gives the year when he is writing according to the Seleucid era, the era of Alexander. And if we convert that date into Anno Domini or Common Era dating, we arrive at 712, 713. As I already said, this new text covers the entire span of human history from Adam to basically 20 years before the time of writing. And it's a translation from a lost Syriac original. This can be seen from several features, but just to give you one very telling example, the Syriac particle de, of, in this case of Josephus, Flavius Josephus, was misunderstood as part of a name. So, but there are also other elements in the Arabic that show that it's a translation of a Syriac text. I will say more about the scribe later on in the second part of my talk and about the context of the manuscript's production and its later history. As we will see below, the place of composition, although it's not mentioned, is very likely tied to the Marmaroun monastery and the region of Apamea. And the author is an anonymous Syriac-speaking monothelite Christian, Maronite Christian. Now, those of you who work on early Islam and especially on the 7th century should get excited about this text because obviously since it covers the 7th century, it will be of relevance for understanding the rise of Islam, the Byzantine-Sasanian War, and many other events in the 7th century. It goes without saying that all these books that you see on screen that cover a vast array of sources on the 7th century in Syriac, Greek, and other languages do not mention this new text. So the Maronite Chronicle of 713 will be a very valuable addition to the corpus of sources discussing the 7th century and the appearance of Islam, along with many other genres, of course, that are already known. Here is a brief synopsis of the Chronicle and what it covers. As I said, it starts from Adam, and the first part is basically a history of the Bible, very brief at times. And here the main source probably that the author is using is Eusebius's lost chronicle, which is already quite significant. Then there is a very interesting ecclesiastic part where the chronicle covers basically the history of the church up to his time. And here he's also using some sources that are otherwise known, but he's also adding a lot of his own material or material that we don't know from anywhere else. So here the chronicle is also quite exciting in terms of new data that it offers. And then for the 7th century, the really significant thing about it is that it shows systematic parallels with a group of sources that have been known for a long time in scholarship to belong to a group, to belong to a common group or to depend on a common lost source. namely the chronicles of Theophanes, of Agapius of Mabbug, the Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, and an anonymous chronicle in Syriac to the year 1234. So basically, especially for the 7th century, this new text will have to be studied together with these other sources. And I will show you a few samples in a minute. Now, what about the Maronite character of this new chronicle? Why does it make sense to call it Maronite? The monastery of Marmaroun appears twice, at least, in the chronicle, but it appears in quite important passages. First, when the author discusses the Council of Chalcedon, which he clearly accepts, and he talks about the foundation of monasteries in the Judean desert, the author also mentions the blessed Marmaroun, who organized to put in order his own monastery around this period. So this is the founder of the Maronite tradition, the ascetic Marmaroun, who is mentioned by Theodoret of Cyrus in the 5th century. But more than the simple mention of this Marmaroun, we have a second reference to the monastery, which I think clearly shows that where the author's allegiance is. So in one passage, it says, in the year 896, era of the Greeks, which corresponds to 584-585, in the second year of the reign of Mauritius, the pious and blessed Elder George, the great righteous one, passed away in the monastery called Marmaroun. He adhered to the church, rejecting the teachings of the dissenters. So we have again the place, the monastery of Marmaroun, and this mysterious figure called George. So who is this person? The only other source of the time that mentions this elusive character, Elder George, is a florilegium, so a collection of excerpts from the Church Fathers from the early 8th century. In this florilegium, which is preserved in a London manuscript in Syriac, we have 3 texts ascribed to a certain George in favor of the idea of monotheletism and monoenergism, so the doctrine of the one will and one energy in Christ. And it's quite obvious, looking at this text, that the George in the Chronicle and the George in this florilegium are one and the same person. First of all, we know from the florilegium that George had written a letter to a certain Abraham of Resapha, Sergiopolis, which corresponds with the period of his activity. So the only Abraham that we know was active in the second half of the 6th century. So this confirms the date of George's death, 585. So they were contemporaries. And then he's referred to with exactly the same terms. So in the Syriac florilegium, he's called the Elder, so George, and in the Chronicle, he's called Sheikh. So it's quite clearly the same person. And the fact that he's tied to the monastery of Marmaroun and defends a monothelite position, so one will in Christ, clearly shows that this is also the context in which the Chronicle was created. Now I will skip over these references. These are later references to the monastery of Marmaroun, and this is just to show that there was a continuing tradition of manuscripts in Syriac at that monastery up to the 10th century. If you want to read more about Syriac monothelite sources, I can recommend this article by Jack Tanous. Interestingly, all of these sources, which are not very many, date from around the same time that we have our chronicles, so the beginning of the 8th century. So we can now put together a small corpus of Syriac sources together with the chronicle, which bring to light this, let's say, forgotten episode in the history of Syro-Chalcedonian, of the Syro-Chalcedonian tradition. A brief excursus on another aspect of the chronicle that I think might be very interesting for historians. It has a distinctive interest in natural phenomena, especially earthquakes and eclipses and other celestial phenomena. And the information that it provides is quite accurate. So just to give you an example, the eclipse of 512, it gives a precise date for it, which is confirmed by modern astronomical research. And there's one earthquake in 664, which I couldn't find any mention of elsewhere. So it might be interesting to compare, with scholars working or with scientists working on earthquakes to see if this can be somehow, or with archaeologists to see if this can be confirmed somehow. Now, interestingly, remember that the chronicle was written in 713. We do have a report for the same year, which mentions a devastating earthquake that affected the region of Syria. And it's very likely either that the author stopped, you remember that the chronicle stops abruptly, either he was affected by this earthquake and stopped writing his chronicle, or under the impression of this earthquake that he experienced, he sort of sat down and wrote this history where he recorded previous such occurrences. In any case, it can't be a coincidence that the precise year in which he's writing also witnessed a significant, important or devastating earthquake. So that's just a sort of parenthesis on the more natural history side of the chronicle. I already mentioned that Apamea and the region of Apamea is a very likely candidate for the place of production. I'm saying this because there are a few details in the chronicle that are not known from anywhere else, and they relate to the history of Apamea. So in the late 6th century, we have the Byzantine-Sasanian War, one of them, in which Apamea is destroyed. So we have this report here from the chronicle in the year 885, 573, 574. Adur-Mahan, so general, rose up and captured Apamea and led its inhabitants to Persia. And he set fire and burned down the great church, which was in the city, together with all the adornments of the city. And Jordanes, the bishop, set things in order there afterwards and built and renewed the church. So interestingly, the destruction of the great church of Apamea and also this bishop, Jordanes, are nowhere else mentioned. So this is clearly an author who has good information or reliable information about the local history of Apamea, either from the city or from somewhere in the vicinity. Now let's turn to a few examples from the 7th century, which are quite exciting, as I said, because they have all these parallels to known sources, and they might shed some new light on the history of this period. So here again, the synopsis showing the periods covered, including the 7th century. It really covers all the main events, religious and political, starting with the truce and the friendship between the Byzantine Emperor Maurice and Khosrow II. It mentions Phocas's overthrow by Heraclius, the Sasanian-Byzantine War of 626-28, which finished with the victory of Heraclius. Then discusses the Sasanian succession after Khosrow II. It mentions Muhammad and his preaching, although those passages are in some of the pages that are not well preserved, unfortunately. And then the Arab conquests. So really interesting events covered by the chronicle. So just to give you a taste of how this looks like, for the year 633, 634, the chronicle discusses, among other things, a battle between Theodoric, the brother of Heraclius, against the Arabs. So it says, Theodoric, the emperor's brother, took the Roman army and marched against the Arabs, but the Romans were afflicted or defeated and fled before them. Very likely this refers to a battle known from Muslim sources as the Battle of Ajnadain in July 634. And then immediately afterwards, the chronicle mentions a comet appearing in the heavens, signifying the wrath that would befall the land at the Arabs' hands, which, as I will show in a second, refers to a comet that was visible in September 634. Now, as you can see from this table, the other well-known histories of Theophanes, Michael, and Agapius mention both events, but they revert the order. And it can be argued, I won't do it here in detail, but it can be argued that the order of events in the chronicle, in the new chronicle, makes more sense. So that you have first the battle, which we know from other sources happened in July, and then immediately afterwards the comet visible in the sky. The other historians seem to mix up the Battle of Theodoric with maybe perhaps one or several later battles. So here, even though the information provided by the chronicle is quite short, by comparing it to what we already know from other sources, this may actually help us understand the chronology of the early stages of the Arab conquest better. Yeah, so here's the comet. Actually, it's quite interesting that the comet mentioned can be confirmed by independent sources in Latin, Chinese, and Japanese histories, which dated precisely to September 634. So it's quite clear that the chronicle has reliable information on the events. And there's the book that you can see on the right has a sort of modern rendition of Khalid ibn al-Walid's armies before Damascus, and you can see the comet in the skies there. We could do the same exercise by comparing, passages in the chronicle with Theophanes and the others, but I won't spend too much time on this. Just to show briefly another example, it has this reference after the decisive battle between the Byzantines and the Arabs at Gabita or Yarmouk. The chronicle says that the fear of the Arabs fell upon the Byzantines until this very day. So that's quite it's quite an interesting statement, because it shows that the author was much closer to the events than what we have in the later sources. And as you can see from this table, really the events discussed are systematically parallel to the later sources, Theophanes and the others. But before you get too excited, I have to say, I already mentioned some of these pages are unfortunately damaged, and some of them are very difficult to read. But even where we have a few details, I think they are very relevant and could help us understand the history of the 7th century better. Just to give you an example here, so the manuscript is not really, you can't decipher much, but with a bit of patience, you can see that, for example, here there's a reference to the island of Cyprus and its conquest. So for these pages, at least, there's a long way to go for a proper edition of the manuscript. As I said, there's quite a bit of research on the common source behind Theophanes, Agapius, Michael, and the anonymous chronicle. Here is just a selection of the most recent, more important publications. It will need to be determined by future research where the new chronicle fits in this genealogy or in this stemma of historical sources about the 7th century. So if you adhere to the old model that believes that all of these later historians depend on the lost history of Theophilus, the new Maronite Chronicle would probably work as a source of Theophilus because it's earlier than him. If you subscribe to the newer view that is more complex and takes into account much wider array of sources, the chronicle could fit here or perhaps in another place. This still has to be researched properly. Or here, another attempt of a genealogy of these texts in Robert Hoyland. Again, the Maronite Chronicle would fit somewhere there at the bottom of the tree. So to conclude this first part, about the chronicle itself, there are connections to the already known Maronite Chronicle of 664, but it's not the same text. It's also not the Chronicle of Theophilus because it's too early. It is not the Eastern source behind all the later historians, but it is certainly one of the sources used by later historians in some form or the other. And perhaps it may be an independent branch of the same tradition. So clearly the text is relevant for Syriac historiography, but also for the history of Monotheletism and the Maronites, for Byzantine and Islamic history in the 7th century, and also for Syro-Arabic translations, because as you remember, we don't have the Syriac original, but only an Arabic translation of it. And this takes me to the second part, where we sort of discuss the reception of this text. Why did it end up in a forgotten manuscript on Sinai, and what can we say about the context of its production? As I said, so the manuscript is bound together from two distinct parts. One older part containing biblical books, folios 1 to 83, and the second part that we have already discussed, which is clearly later than the first part that you can see here in an image on your right. So, can we identify the scribe and the context of production? Already last year, when I contacted Alexander Triger about this manuscript, and we had a sort of email conversation about it, he suggested to me that the script looks very similar to a manuscript that he had worked on, Sinai Arabic 268, which contains a translation of the Dionysian corpus, Pseudo-Dionysius Areopagita, copied in 1225 in Damascus by a scribe called Pimen. Fortunately, in the meantime, Habib Ibrahim wrote an excellent article that I'm drawing on here about this scribe, Pimen Asikri, moine copiste la cellule de moine Sinaïta Damas, so published last year. So I already had the hint of Alexander Triger to look and compare my manuscript to Sinai Arabic 268, which we know was written by this Pimen. So who was this Pimen, the scribe? He's known to have copied several Arabic manuscripts that you can see listed here. I'm drawing all this from Habib Ibrahim's article. What we can reconstruct from his biography is that he was probably born in Damascus at the turn of the century. His name, the Lavrayot, from the Suqa of Mar Elias, close to Antioch, shows that he was a monk there. He was active in two periods in Damascus, in the 1220s and then later in the 1230s, with a gap of approximately 10 years between the two periods of activity. And I'll return to this in a second. And apparently he had a group of collaborators and continuators who started to copy, to produce manuscripts, perhaps at the initiative of the Melkite Patriarch, to produce copies of important patristic texts in Arabic translation. So I went to compare the scripts as suggested by Alexander Triger. Here you can see a few comparisons between 597 and 268, copied by Pimen in 1225. Now, maybe just, let's see. I hope you can see the right pointers. So you can see there are similarities in the execution of some, words, for instance, here. Also the same tendency to extend certain letters at the end that you can see here and here, or here, and also the tendency to cram or superscribe the final letters in words at the end of the line. But they're very similar, but perhaps not identical. Now, I compared them to a second manuscript copied by Pimen, which has a bit more of a cursive writing, copied during his second period of activity, so in 1237. This is Sinai Arabic 418, which contains the Synaxarion. And I hope you'll agree with me, and we can discuss this, that the script is really the product of the same hand. So if you look at how he writes Kathira here in Sinai 597, and here in the other manuscript, also the use of identical paragraph marks, or you have fa-fi here in both manuscripts, also this ligature in Sadis or Sadisa, and the quasi-identical script where he, you can see here for Madinatul Constantinia, so the city of Constantinople, that appears fortunately in both manuscripts. Unless you have arguments otherwise, I would really tend to identify the scribe following Alexander Triger's suggestion with Pimen, which is relevant because that gives us a very specific context for the production of the manuscript. Again, following Ibrahim's study, we know of other scribes active together with him in Damascus in this period that you can see here. And judging by the similarity to the second manuscript, I would say that also Sinai Arabic 597 was probably copied in this later period. So perhaps 1236, 1237, around that time. Pimen disappears afterwards, so we have no later manuscripts after this date. And it would fit together with what we see otherwise in this group of scribes. So they're interested in recovering earlier Arabic translations of patristic texts. They probably had access to some ancient manuscripts in Damascus, and it may also, the copy of this manuscript may be connected to Pimen's lost decade, where he, according to Ibrahim, possibly went back to the region of Antioch to find more manuscripts. So let's explore these two possibilities. First, we know that Pimen and Nilus, his continuator, either recopied or restored manuscripts from an early 11th century owner or copyist, Ibn Sakhun, who also translated the Corpus Dionysiacum into Arabic. So we have at least two examples of this group of scribes being interested or restoring manuscripts that were already 200 years old. So perhaps our manuscript that Pimen copied was found among the lost library of this Ibn Sakhun. So that's one speculative possibility. But overall, I would say it's more likely that Pimen got hold of this manuscript in the area of Antioch. So Ibrahim in his study argues that Pimen was a monk at Mar Elias Monastery, which was still active in the region of close to Antioch in the early 13th century. And this monastery of Mar Elias is very important because during the Byzantine period, when the area was reconquered by the Byzantines, this monastery was a very active center of manuscript production, both in Syriac and in Arabic. So here I put together a list based on secondary literature, but also my own research, of 11th century manuscripts produced or copied in this St. Elias Monastery close to Antioch. So you can see there's several, or actually more than 20 manuscripts copied on the Black Mountain. Many of them can be linked to the monastery of Mar Elias. So these are 11th century manuscripts in Syriac, and a similar list can be made also for Arabic manuscripts. So this was clearly still in the 13th century. This was a very important monastery with a sizable library, including also older manuscripts, so 11th century manuscripts. It is thus very likely that Pimen found this chronicle in the library of Mar Elias. It's, of course, speculative, we can't know for sure, but it's very likely, I would say. And we have the example of another contemporary of his, also highlighted by Ibrahim in his study, another scribe called Gabriel, who exactly around the same time buys old manuscripts from Mar Elias Monastery in Syriac, or copies manuscripts based on models from manuscripts in Mar Elias Monastery. So he's also a bilingual scribe, so you can see here he signs his colophons both in Syriac and Arabic. So all this makes sense if we put everything together. So we have Pimen and Gabriel and perhaps others who are interested in the holdings of the library monastery at Mar Elias, close to Antioch. So I'm almost at the end, but just to conclude about the manuscript's history, Pimen probably copied it in Damascus in the 1230s, possibly brought it from the Lavra of Mar Elias close to Antioch, and later it reached Sinai. Now, at Sinai, there's not much trace of its use, but at the end of the manuscript, we have fragments of a typicon, of a liturgical handbook, let's say, with a calendar. And the closest parallels to it I could find are in other two Sinai manuscripts with the same text, with the same typicon. So probably this last part was copied on Sinai. Somebody used the last folios of Sinai Arabic 597 to transcribe parts of this typicon using another Sinai manuscript. So very likely this is the latest use the manuscript ever had before it was forgotten and until Porfiry Uspensky saw it in the 1850s. As an epilogue, and returning to the question of the Maronite nature of this chronicle, some of you may know that in the 11th century we have a period in which Maronites translate some of their theological works into Arabic, and there's also an original theological text by a Maronite, Thomas of Kafartab, in Arabic at the end of this century. I'm mentioning this because it might give us a clue to who and when translated our lost chronicle from Syriac into Arabic. Again, it's quite speculative, but in Thomas's works at the end of the 11th century, we have this reference to the beginnings of the Monothelite-Diothelite schism. And at some point when he speaks about Maximus the Confessor, Thomas mentions that the story of Maximus is recorded in our historical sources and also in yours, meaning the Melkites' historical sources. So I would see this context at the end of the 11th century as a very likely context in which our chronicle was translated into Arabic. And then somehow may have ended up in the monastery of Mar Elias. Now, why wasn't it used later by Maronites? You may guess the reason for this. So we have a very important reference in William of Tyre, who was a historian of the Crusades, obviously, and he mentions that the Maronites, who had been heretics, according to him, choose to return to the Catholic Church, and they approach the Latin Patriarch of Antioch, Emery, and ask him to be reunited with the Catholic Church. And there was some success to this rapprochement because we know from Pope Innocent III that he wrote a letter to the Maronite Patriarch Jeremiah, who attended the Lateran Council in 1215. So precisely at the beginning of the 13th century, we have this first phase of, let's say, union between the Maronite clergy, the Maronite Church, and Rome. And obviously, this union also meant revisiting some of the theological issues, for instance, the issue of Christ's will. So possibly precisely around this time, early 13th century, they really didn't want to use any historical sources that would present the history of the Maronite Church as being or as having some monothelite past. So really, this is the cusp of the period in which the chronicle was, let's say, forgotten or ignored in a context of rapprochement between the Maronites and Rome. And also, fortunately, the same context was interesting for the Melkites, such as Pimen, to recover this manuscript for historical or antiquarian reasons. Right, so later Maronite history clearly didn't have any knowledge of the Maronite chronicle that we discussed today. It lay forgotten on Mount Sinai until very recently. So this is my last slide. Just a short article about the discovery will be published in the next few days, maybe on the 1st of December, or in any case, very soon. A second longer study is forthcoming, and as I said already, I'm preparing a full edition and English translation with notes of this chronicle. And I think I don't have to repeat now why I think this chronicle is relevant for so many reasons for scholarship. So that's it from me. I'm sorry I took too long, and I look forward to the discussion.